We are recording. We are live. Well, not live. We're recording. Welcome to the podcast, folks. We are here with Timothy Moore, and we're going to get to an introduction for him in a second here. But I did want to start off by, well, first of all, we're going to be doing long-form podcasting here, so we're going to get, an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours, maybe 3 or 4 of conversation, unedited. We're going to put the whole thing out. We weren't able to do that last time due to some unforeseen technical issues.
Unforeseen tech issues.
Yes, so
it was Mike's fault.
It was Mike's fault. It was
Mike's fault.
It was all Mike, but he felt really bad about it. So I forgive him. I forgive you, Mike. I forgive you.
Thank you.
Okay.
I appreciate the forgiveness.
Of course, yeah. So I did want to start off too. The few clips that I put out, I got a lot of feedback from different people, and one of the people I got a response from. He's a good friend of mine. We sit down, get coffee, breakfast, occasionally talk politics, current events, the meaning of life, philosophy, religion, all this good stuff. Anyway. I sent him the clips, and he responded. He was like, "Oh, you guys are discussing, the history of race," and his next question was, "What party?" Now he leans conservative, and look, I'm not. He's a great guy. I really like him. I'm not saying his name because I'm not trying to make an example of him. What I am saying is this is one of the main reasons I'm starting this podcast. Nowadays, everything is about left and right. It's mostly partisan. It's us versus them mentality, and that leads to a lot of not only generalizations but misunderstandings. And that's one of the main reasons I'm doing this, is because I want to try my best to present the information as objectively as possible and let you, the viewer, the watcher, my fans, decide for themselves what the what to think of it. So that's something I wanted to start off with and address it right away. Now, please, Timothy Moore, introduce yourself, give a background of what you're doing currently for work, and I guess some of your educational background and whatnot.
Well, thanks for inviting me, Colin. This is, I think that you're to be applauded in this endeavor. I think there's a niche for people that are interested in listening to sustained conversations that don't go into the high decibel zone.
Civil.
Civil. Well, I hope so, and I applaud you, and I hope you can generate a followership on this.
I like that word, followership.
Thanks for having me. I was a teacher for 30 years. Had always had an interest in early American history that really kind of started with events in the early mid-'80s. I got very interested in the Constitution, the creation of the Constitution. So I taught American history, American government, politics, political science type stuff. But at the end of 30 years in the classroom, I was able to get over to the University of Wisconsin. So I'm a historian in the history department. And we...
At Madison?
At Madison. And we, our specialty is the creation and ratification of the Constitution. So we...
so like the Founding Fathers.
Yeah, we spend every day of our working lives is slogging around between pretty much 1787 to 1791. So it's kind of a niche.
Very specialized.
Interest. Yeah, pretty much. But that's I'm a documentary editor at the Center for the Study of the American Constitution, which is in the history department at Madison.
Sounds very prestigious.
Well, I don't know. It is fascinating, and we're very fortunate to have the opportunity to be there now for the last 10 years. So,
yeah. All right. Well, I did want to start off with a question. I hear this said mostly by folks on the right. Once again, this is nothing against conservatives. I want to address this right away. I hear a lot of the time Democrats started the KKK.
Mm-hmm.
Democrats are the party of, real, not repression, oppression.
Well, it's a guilt by association move, I think. Anytime you can paint a group with something like that, it's I think I think many people do those kinds of things for various reasons, but and ultimately I don't know exactly what's going on there when somebody would say that, but.
So I guess the question is, did the Democrats start the KKK? Is kind of what the...
Well, yeah, I think as with most things, yes, that's true. Southern Democrats, after the war, Southerners felt like they were being abused by Northern what they call radical Republicans in Congress.
After the Civil War.
After the Civil War. And there were all kinds of laws passed by the Congress that was controlled by Republicans. Southerners were not in Congress because they had been barred from being elected into Congress. The 13th and 14th Amendment were passed. And so Southerners felt a deep resentment towards Republicans and Northerners in general for meddling in trying to reconstruct the South.
Because they had no representation in Congress.
Correct. And as you might expect, a lot of Northerners weren't really excited about having Southerners in Congress. They looked at it as you seceded, we're going to define you as traitors. And so some Republicans in the North were very punitive towards the South. And this is
punitive,
meaning harsh treatment. This is, Lincoln. Lincoln, at the end of his life and towards the end of the war, we don't know how Lincoln would have treated the South. We have some glimmers, some of the speeches that he made, with charity towards all. And would he have been nice and soft to the South? He had kind of a very quick plan of reconstruction, but the radicals in Congress did not have a soft reconstruction. They wanted a harsh reconstruction. So the background to the creation of illegal terrorist organizations like the Klan was Southern resentment of Republicans coming south and attempting to reconstruct the South. And the Southerners didn't want to be reconstructed. They felt, many Southerners felt like the pre-Civil War South, the antebellum South, was just fine. And they were going to do everything they could to maintain that system. So yeah, there were all kinds of organizations like the Klan. Klan, most famous of those reactionary, what I would consider reactionary vigilante groups, and many.
And what did they do exactly? To start with, originally,
it's interesting. You look at the Klans.
You have 6 guys in a garage. They get together.
No,
and say, hey, let's put on hoods and.
No, they were Confederate generals. Got together in a hotel in Nashville, and it kind of came up with the idea. And you look at their bylaws, and they define themselves as a paternal organization. I think the quote is to take care of the widows and orphans, and to protect the innocent.
The widows, due to the Civil War, yes. for the husbands who died.
And to protect them from the lawless Northern radical Republicans seeking to reconstruct the South. So they define themselves as a paternalistic organization. And you can find instances where they travel around, in communities and hand out food and provide for widows and orphans. Now, the other side of this is, to get into the club, you had to basically commit to a white supremacist agenda and say that you never were in the Union Army, never liked the Union Army, didn't like anything associated with the North. So they define themselves as a benevolent, paternalistic, fatherly care kind of organization, but it also is a terrorist organization that roams around at night and intimidates blacks or kills.
It's kind of like Pablo Escobar. He built barrios in Medellin.
I suppose.
But he was also blowing up planes to try to kill politicians. Sure. Okay.
So yes, the short answer is a lot of Southerners were Democrats, and so the Democrats did form the Klan. Now, I think as a historian, I would suggest that things never are frozen in time. I mean, to say that since so many Southern Democrats in the mid 1860s were involved in forming the Klan, that means the modern Democratic Party is in favor of the Klan. I mean, there's just too much history between 1860s and now to make that a clean. That's not a clean family tree to go, from the 1860s to now. So I mean, it just in fact the whole party alignment has changed, starting actually in the 1930s. I think you start to see African Americans move away from being Republicans, the party of Lincoln, to the Democratic Party, and certainly solidifies by the 1960s with Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs. So it's yes is the answer, but it also is kind of...
It's more murky than that.
Yeah.
These quote Democrats were white supremacists who they did some good for their community, but they only cared about their community and were also
in the sense that they wanted to maintain a pre-Civil War social system. Yeah. Okay. With blacks being second class status or
second class at best.
At best, right.
At very best.
Right.
Okay. Well, one of the things I wanted to get to today would be, I want to cover the civil rights movement before the actual civil rights movement. So before Martin Luther King Jr., before Malcolm X, before Stokely Carmichael. Is that okay?
Stokely Carmichael?
I was wondering if it was Carmichael Stokely, and I was like, that doesn't sound right.
Stokely Carmichael.
So, and you were telling me earlier that in order to kind of understand, these civil rights folks like David Walker, Nat Turner's Rebellion, in order to do... Thanks, Mike. Much appreciated. We did that last time, too. I made a mental note to take care of that, and I obviously I failed miserably with that.
The acoustics are so much better now.
Oh, you can hear the difference. You can really hear the difference.
Well, I'm sure the listeners are also very interested in what type of hand soap you're using. So.
Oh, yeah. And the brand of toothbrush. These are the important things we want to cover with the podcast. We don't really care about civil rights. I mean, Come on, let's talk toothpaste here. No, but you were telling me that in order to understand things going on pre-Civil War with activists and after, and even leading up to through World War One, up through World War II, and then the Civil Rights Movement, you kind of have to get an understanding for the Revolution and how that kind of set the foundation for it.
Yeah.
So talk about that a little bit.
Well, for better or worse, Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence gives us a wonderfully impossible phrase. It's one of the greatest phrases in American history, maybe the English language. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. And it's that concept of equality that has proven to be a beautiful burden for us.
A beautiful burden.
It is, because, first of all, what does that mean, that all men are created equal? Well, so to your question is, I kind of hear your question is like, when did the civil rights movement begin? I'm going to suggest that the civil rights movement begins when Jefferson makes the claim that all men are created equal.
Because you look at that and you say, all men? Are all men created equal?
Well, right. Or if you believe that, I mean, there's several problems with it. First of all, the obvious one, that he's a slave owner. And then the problem is, if he says that, created equal, but I look around and I see people that are smarter than me, I see people that are more wealthy, I see inequities in life.
Regardless of race.
Sure. So what does that mean? And I think a lot of our history, we've tried to sort out the meaning of that. So when it comes to the civil rights movement, I think that phrase in the Declaration is tremendously problematic in the sense that, okay, does it mean, well, there's different intellectual...
What does a man mean is the real question.
Well, I think he did mean it in a generic sense. I don't think he was referring to gender there. It is interesting, though, in about 70 years later, some women got together in Seneca Falls, New York, and it was arguably the Seneca Falls Convention was the first women's convention in our history, 1848. They borrowed Jefferson's language from the Declaration of Independence and kind of riffed on it to establish the fact that they, as women, had not been seen as equal in the Declaration.
And the question is also, all men are created equal. Are black men included in that? That's kind of the civil.
So immediately, right
question.
out of the chute, we have this tremendous problem. What does that mean? Does it mean intellectual equality? Probably not, because there are smarter people than other people. It doesn't mean economics. It doesn't. So I mean, does it mean socially that all people are on the same social plane? There's all kinds of problems associated with how you interpret that phrase, that men are created equal. And so I'm going to suggest from right out of the chute, we have a problem in this country of defining what that means. And several years later, we get to the Constitution, where African American slavery is set up and codified and protected in the Constitution. The Fugitive Slave Clause, if you're a runaway, the laws were passed that allowed you to go get your property that had run away. The 3/5 clause, it gives southern states more representation. It counted, every 3 slaves counted as a person. So in their census, which increased their representation in the House of Representatives. So there's a tremendous, our Constitution, it kind of sets up a system that protects slavery. And all along, we're insisting that all men are created equal. So it's a tremendous problem for our country. And so when you have, it's interesting, in the American Revolution, the British, they would say, Americans were using this, the British are treating us like slaves. If we submit to British tyranny, it's no better than being slaves. It's slavery if we submit to British tyranny. So the British, without missing a beat, would say, isn't that interesting that Americans, what is that? One British writer said, what is that I hear in the background but the agonies and cries of slaves from people claiming to be treated like slaves? So, so there's a tremendous irony in the rhetoric of the revolution about being treated as...
So that kind of nonsense existed forever.
Oh, absolutely.
It's not just exclusive to today.
And after the American Revolution, there was an interesting set of letters that went back and forth between George Washington and Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette was one of those foreigners that came over seeking fame and fortune in the American Revolution. He was a Frenchman.
Searching for the American dream?
No, I think, well, in Lafayette's case, I think he was young and he kind of was excluded from kind of the in crowd in France. So he saw the American Revolution as a way to kind of raise his stock and get some cred back home. So he comes as a very young man. I think he was like 19, 20 years old when he came, and immediately introduced himself to Washington and says, you ought to hire me as a general. And Washington looked at him like, who the heck are you? Now, eventually he grew to respect Lafayette. In fact, I would suggest there was a deep, deep abiding friendship between them. But after the war, back to getting on the topic, Marquis de Lafayette writes Washington and says, I have recently purchased, I forget the acreage, in the Caribbean. And wouldn't it be great if we take ex-slaves and set up a system here in the Caribbean and show the world that, that slaves are not inferior? Would you like to be involved in this project? And Washington writes back and says, interesting idea. Let's talk about it the next time you come to America and you stop by Mount Vernon. We need to talk about this. Now, there's no, so my point being here is during the revolution, immediately after the revolution, there's some people that fought in that war that understood that this slavery problem is a real hypocrisy. Jefferson feared too. I mean, there's this famous quote that I fear that if God is a just God, He's going to judge this country for us having slaves. And that comes from a slave owner. It's like holding a wolf by the ears. Yeah. If you let go of that wolf, you're going to get bit. If you hold on to the wolf, you're going to get bit. So the founders were tremendously conflicted about slavery, and Lafayette posed this experiment, and Washington never acted on it, and we don't really know whether they really actually talked about this idea. So from the get-go, slavery is a problem in the country. And with the first, Missouri, when it petitioned to become part of the country in 1819, the question was, well, if they come in, does slavery go west? It was all about maintaining a balance in the Senate. So if Missouri comes in, and the eventual bargain was Missouri can come in as slave, and Maine would come in free as free state, and the balance in the Senate would be maintained. So every piece of turf we gained is in the 1800s as we moved west. Slavery was the question: does it go there or not? So there's always the issue of slavery. Now, does the anti-slavery movement pre-Civil War equal civil rights movement? Now that's a perspective. I think some people would say no. The civil rights movement isn't until later, but I'm going to suggest for your consideration that maybe there is a civil rights movement before the Civil War.
Far before.
Sure.
During the Revolution.
Sure. And this push for equality, whether it means economic or social or whatever category of equality you want to talk about, I'm going to suggest that those are issues that are rumbling around in America. Within the slave community, within the free black community, within the white community, there's a tremendous discussion about what is the status of slaves and freedmen.
And the essential question here is all men are created equal. In my mind, I think to myself, okay, so that means, hang on. Okay. In my mind, I think to myself, okay, all men are created equal. Does that mean all men and women, obviously, deserve equal rights? Because as far as, there are people who are stronger, faster, smarter.
Sure.
There are people who are dumber, or,
Sure.
Sure. Unfortunately, people
Sure.
aren't equal as far as physical characteristics and capability. Now, so the question is whether or not it's about rights, right?
Well, no, because I think, as we all know, women didn't get the right to vote until 1920. Could you see someone as equal if they didn't have the same amount of rights? And for most of American history, the answer to that has been, yeah, you can be equal with me, but that doesn't mean you have the same rights. Kids can't vote. So there's this struggle of what is the meaning of that equality. So rights doesn't automatically, in our history, rights does not automatically translate into equality. Does not automatically translate.
It's interesting that you say kids can't vote, because maybe this has always been a discussion that's existed, but I see recently kind of a movement towards we need to listen to kids more. We need to get. I forget where. I don't know who proposed it. I want to say it was Nancy Pelosi. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but to get 16-year-olds to be able to vote. I don't know who that. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, I don't know either.
I know
that's rumbled around quite a bit.
There was a movement to get six. I don't know if I want 18-year-olds to vote. I only say that because when I was 18, I just look at myself at 18 and be like, yeah, I should not have been able to cast a vote for anything.
Well, that came out of the Vietnam era. If you're young enough to go to the swamps of Vietnam to die, you should be old enough to vote for the people that are sending you to the swamps.
And I hear that said about buying alcohol and cigarettes. Well, cigarettes got raised to 21, but I hear that too. Is you can go to Iraq and get killed by an RPG. Yeah. But you can't buy a 6-pack. Right. Okay. Well, moving on, I suppose.
Well, I don't know if you wanted to talk about pre-Civil War civil rights leaders.
What else do you want to get to as far as the American Revolution?
I think that's plenty, because I know you wanted to get to.
There was a discussion long before the civil rights movement, long before the Civil War.
Yeah, and I think my argument is it's set up by that phrase in the Declaration of what does it mean to be equal.
Okay. One of the figures I wanted to talk about for starters, was David Walker.
Oh, yeah. David Walker.
Good old Davey. Dave, I don't know what they call him.
David.
I'm not sure what they call him, but David Walker.
He was an angry young man.
Yeah, he quite angry. I mean, I suppose rightfully so, but
Sure.
so he was born 20 years after 1776, 20 years after the Declaration of Independence. And he died, well, he had something called Walker's Appeal, right?
Yeah, that's his most famous writing.
And that was in 1829, so about 30 years before the Civil War, just for context for you folks out there.
Yes. Yeah, Walker's interesting. I think he's born in the South and he moves to Massachusetts. I think he owns a clothing store. And winds up rubbing shoulders with a lot of abolitionists in an African-American church. And he really becomes, today the word is woke, I guess, over the issue. And so he begins a lot of abolitionist activities, and then he writes this Walker's Appeal, which is a remarkable piece of literature. It's long, but it's also very, very strident, very militant for the time. I mean, it was banned in the South. If you got caught with this in the South, it was punishable by law. So yeah, Walker's Appeal is it's interesting because he actually says that it's interesting for a couple of reasons. One, immediately he says, like, African Americans and slaves should rise up and take their freedom. He encourages and got accused, and I think reasonably so, for encouraging slave revolts. And that's why it was banned in the South, because any freedman, and there were freedmen in the South that would get a hold of this, could be kind of the channel.
And freedman was a name for a free slave.
Free
person.
They never maybe were in slavery. Now, there were very few of those in the South, more of those in the North.
Because in his case, his mother was a free person, and his father was a slave.
Yes.
If one of your parents was
mother, all your status was determined by mother.
Oh, so if your father was free and your mother wasn't, it didn't matter.
Yeah.
I wonder if that was because men could just go around.
Well, it definitely.
Oh, look, I got 70 women pregnant. That's 70 free people.
It definitely perpetuated racial rape. So your status was determined by your mother. So that's why he was a free person.
Is that why it was set up like that?
Yes.
Because men had the potential to go around getting how many?
Yeah, you could hop the fence on the planet.
Can't have too many free people was the idea.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So yeah, Walker is in Boston and publishes this thing, and it's interesting because later on, David Walker is cited by many like traditional civil rights leaders, like in the 50s, 1950s,
and Frederick Douglass as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And he's cited as kind of the origin of African Americans being involved in abolitionism. I mean, I think when we're in school, we're kind of taught that abolitionists are white Northerners, leading the cause. But and I think Walker's interesting because he's an African American, and he's saying, no, African Americans need to be involved in this civil rights issue of abolitionism, and advocates that African Americans take a role in that. I mean, I have this one quote that might illuminate how radical this is seen.
Yeah.
I don't know if this thing will pop up on my machine, but the gist of it is this. He says, if you're a slave and you kill a slave owner, I don't see any problem with that. That's just like if somebody, slavery is a system that's going to kill you. So to kill someone who's trying to kill you is not a crime.
That's just natural.
Yeah. It's just the same survival. As, he equated it with thirst. If somebody's denying you water, it's unnatural, and you have a natural desire for liberty. You have a natural desire for water. So what's the problem? So, I mean, people read this like, holy cow, this is promoting slave revolts. And So it was really a remarkable, and he also, a part of Walker's appeal, he goes after Christianity quite a bit too, that, the hypocrisy of a nation that had a lot of Christians in it, but yet would still treat people um, in this kind of system. So he goes after the hypocrisy of American Christianity. He also proposes, in later civil rights leaders, some of them actually say, if you want to see this black nationalism, where like we don't really want or need white people involved in our movement of liberation, that African Americans should be solely responsible for this. So
white people stay out of this.
Yeah.
Is our fight. This is our fight.
Right, and so because they're like when we're kids, we're taught that William Lloyd Garrison is the quintessential. He's a white.
I've never heard of William.
Well, you might not have been paying super close attention in high school.
Oh, that's a definitely.
I'm sure Mike remembers William Lloyd Garrison. Right?
Do you remember? Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, of course you
Who the hell that is?
So William Lloyd Garrison is a newspaper man in Boston, Massachusetts. He's an abolitionist. So do white people have a role in abolitionism? Well, David Walker is kind of seen by many later civil rights leaders as kind of, you want to see where black nationalism, African Americans themselves liberating themselves without the assistance of white people. Walker is often seen as kind of, that's where it begins.
And when Walker was around, didn't Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, he put out some kind of letter that was criticized for being derogatory towards
well,
blacks?
Very early in his career, he wrote Notes on the State of Virginia, which you look at and he speculates all kinds of, there's all kinds of racist language.
And that was one of the main things David Walker was critical of Jefferson.
Well, sure, and others. I mean, Walker also is making the argument that white abolitionists, although they're in favor of abolitionism, you could be a racist and still be an abolitionist. You could oppose slavery, but you could also say, but wait a minute, I'm not sure that I want social equality.
That's interesting.
So
you could be an abolitionist, so you don't want slaves, but you don't like, you don't want actual
you could see them
equality.
as inferior.
Huh.
Yeah, and there were abolitionists like that. And so Walker comes along and says, look, you white abolitionists, you need to understand something. We're just as smart as you are, and if given the chance, we don't actually need your help.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people look to David Walker as kind of maybe the beginnings of this black separatism that certainly comes to the forefront with Garvey in the 20s and then Malcolm X and the Black Panthers in the 1960s.
Now, can you talk about the American Colonization Society?
Oh, yeah.
Because my understanding is they set up, Liberia was an American colony in Africa, where they essentially wanted to be able to send freed slaves to Liberia to not be in America.
Exactly. Now think about what that's really saying. I think and from the very get-go, many African Americans hated the colonization societies because here's what they thought of them. Oh, here's white people forming a colonization society. So they want to free us from slavery, but send us away. And Walker hates colonization. That also was a part of Walker's appeal. Don't send us away. In fact, we actually built this country with our sweat and blood as much as any white person. So you don't get to send us away. I mean, some of the very first, Madison, Monroe, they were all leaders in this there were various colonization organizations, but you're right. Predominantly whites, and many African Americans saw it as racist to get rid of them. We don't want slavery, or we don't want to hang around you. So please go back to Africa. There's also I ran across this the other day that John Brown later he lived in New York for a while. He was a famous abolitionist. There was maybe it was like 500 acres or so up in the Adirondacks of New York. The place was called
what?
The Adirondack Mountains.
Okay.
It was called Timbuktu, and it was set up as kind of a demonstration where African Americans, freed and some of them were actually runaways that would go there and set up this whole town and community and this whole environment of African Americans and show America and the world that African Americans were equal. And so this experiment called Timbuktu in upstate New York was one of those kind of places that kind of is like this colonization. This segregated, separate place for freed slaves.
And John Brown, you said this was John Brown's.
Yeah. Well, he was associated with it. He didn't set it up, but he was kind of a gadfly abolitionist. He roamed all over the country, all the Midwest,
and
New York,
John Brown.
Kansas,
Just a little background on John Brown.
Yeah.
John Brown was a white abolitionist.
Yes.
Who, I mean, he was an abolitionist, but he also was incredibly militant. He believed that it was God's calling for him to. I mean, he killed pro-slavery forces in Kansas. Yes. And raided a federal armory.
Yes.
Correct.
Yes. Kansas was a problem because the Congress, in its infinite wisdom, decided that Kansas could decide when it was going to become a state whether it wanted to be a free state or a slave state. Hmm. Well, automatically that creates two groups of people in Kansas that want their agenda. And so, and it became Bleeding Kansas. Literally, there's a civil war in Kansas before the real Civil War about slavery, pro-slavery forces in Kansas and anti-slavery. So John Brown goes to Kansas to support the anti-slavery movement in Kansas and is involved in a couple of massacres of pro-slavery people, hacked about half a dozen or so in a ditch. And just all kinds of. I mean, he's definitely. You're right. He's a radical abolitionist who feels very comfortable with the use of force. I mean, in that regard, he's kind of like Nat Turner, who preceded John Brown by maybe 20 years. But
he also believed that he had visions. Even
yes.
as a kid and growing up, he believed he had visions.
Sure.
That he was, he believed God was telling him that he needed
yes.
to revolt and kill his masters.
Yeah, there are some similarities between John Brown later and earlier Nat Turner. They both were very religious. I mean, John Brown could quote major portions of the Old Testament.
An interesting thing.
So the use of religion and the use of religion for a liberation is key to both John Brown as well as Nat Turner. Yes. Nat Turner's an African American slave.
There's a stark difference. One of them is white from
New York originally.
New York.
Yeah, and he floated around
somewhere up north. And he was well off, wasn't he?
No, he kind of he never really had much to his name. He floated around the country a lot of times trying to raise money for abolitionist causes. So he was kind of a drifter that kind of glommed on to the abolitionist movement and just really became famous for this raid on a federal arsenal. And he was going to take those weapons and go into Virginia and arm the slaves to liberate themselves in Virginia. And the raid on Harper's Ferry goes bad.
And I mean, one interesting thing is after John Brown was caught, after the raid on the federal armory to try to arm slaves, he said he always, even after he was caught, he said he always followed the golden rule, which is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And it's interesting. I mean, he chopped up pro-slave. I mean, he was a brutal. He went around killing people. And
there are some ironies.
It was an interesting thing I came across, and I was like, oh, well, this guy really believed in what he definitely believed in what he was doing.
His last speech before they took him out and hung him, I've got excerpts here. Had I interfered on behalf of the rich and the powerful and the intelligent, no one would have. It would have been all right, but every man in this court would have deemed it an act of.
Can you start that over?
If I had interfered, John Brown, if I had interfered on behalf of the rich and the powerful, it would have been all right. Mm. But he goes on to say that I've interfered on behalf of the powerless. And so what he's basically saying is this country wants a second-class status and wants slavery. And I believe that the Bible teaches that all men are, that God is no respecter. He references God is no respecter of persons. Yeah. And there's that principle of equality again. I think with a biblical gloss onto it. So his last speech is a remark. I would encourage your listeners maybe to look up John Brown's last speech before he was hung. There's really some interesting things in there.
Look up John Brown alone, but
Yeah.
that speech as well.
And and there are some
I
contradictions.
mean, look up David Walker.
Oh, yeah.
Look up Nat Turner.
Yeah, Turner's interesting. He's one of those.
And I want to get to this real quick here too. One thing I was thinking while I was going through some of the stuff.
You and that mic stand.
Just leave it. Is it really? All right. I did it again. Okay.
What'd you do?
I'm messing with the mic.
Okay.
Maybe it's just like a nervous
Nervous
thing,
tick,
It's
yeah.
a nervous, move it around so it sounds nicer.
I didn't mean to interject. I'm sorry.
You couldn't help it. It's okay, man. I appreciate the sound advice. Okay. One thing I was thinking about was Nat Turner and John Brown. I mean, would these people be considered? I mean, in history, you look at it, they're heroic in a way. I mean, a lot of the things they did was awful. They were
Very divisive.
very divisive. But I mean, they're on the right side of history in the end. My question is this:
let me pose you this though. I mean,
let me just throw this out. Heroes or terrorists, or both?
Well, most people said, look, we agree with John's viewpoint. We just don't agree the way in which he went about it. And I think even today I see some modern parallels. Like there are some folks within the anti-abortion movement that are pretty radicalized, and those folks that are in the anti-abortion movement would say, look, I don't think, I'm opposed to abortion, but I'm not in favor of shooting abortion doctors on their way out the door when they go home to work. So I think there's some interesting parallels between some of the more radical anti-abortion folks. And I was in the helm of one person years ago who had a picture. He was a radical anti-abortion person. He had a picture of John Brown in his living room. It was his hero.
No kidding.
He saw a real
anti-abortion.
Yeah. Well, the point being that we've had this horrific. I mean, in his mind, we've had this horrific system called abortion in this country, and we've tried to use the system to change the system, and it is not. So now it's appropriate.
Extreme measures.
Yeah, and so John Brown that was his argument. We've tried to legislate slavery out, but it keeps moving west into new territories and the new states. Now is the time where that violence may be appropriate. So I think there's some interesting parallels there between John Brown's approach to anti-slavery and maybe some of the more radical groups associated with the anti-abortion movement.
Let's talk on. We've touched on John Brown, a little bit on David Walker. Let's talk about Nat Turner and his rebellion.
Sure.
I guess you give us some background on Nat Turner, who he was, and what he did.
He's a slave.
He's currently? No, I'm just.
No, he met his demise pretty quickly after the revolt.
Yeah.
He's interesting in the sense that he's one of these. Is an interesting feature in plantation life in some parts of the South. There was an itinerant preacher in some cases that literally a slave owner would have, and Nat Turner was a preacher, and so he would go to multiple plantations during a Sunday, and Younggood.
Okay.
And he would preach, and have religious services on this plantation, and then a little bit later he'd go to a neighboring plantation and he'd do church services.
He would jump around to these different plantations and do sermons.
Great speaker. Somewhat of a mystic, because to your observation, he occasionally would express that he had visions and interpreted celestial events in the sky in terms of it meaning having not only heavenly significance, but significance in terms of what he ought to do in terms of slave revolt. So he was able to circulate around in various plantations. He networked and had a whole network of folks that eventually would join with him in this revolt in the 1830s in Virginia. It's interesting. It begs this. I think it's so interesting when you think about David Walker, African American freedman, Nat Turner, African American slave, South, John Brown, white freedman. So, okay, who's the better abolitionist? William Lloyd Garrison writes a newspaper and publishes it.
Okay,
So who's better at abolition?
William Lloyd Garrison?
He's
address this.
He's a white reformer. In the age of Jackson, before the Civil War,
Andrew Jackson.
Yes.
Okay.
In the age of Jackson, America went through a phase that had tremendous reform movements. Oh, you couldn't swing a dead cat without. Sorry for the PETA people. Sorry.
Yeah.
Mike, can you edit that one out?
Hopefully, PETA gets in touch.
Oh, no.
We can get some publicity.
Anyway, there were all
kinds.
There were all kinds of reform movements pre-Civil War. America got real concerned about becoming a better place, and abolitionism was one of those. But William Lloyd Garrison was one of these white abolitionists, and he felt like if he published enough essays and printed enough persuasive essays that people would be convinced, oh, gee, slavery is bad. So the current debate about abolitionism is like, who's better at it? Are whites who publish newspapers like Garrison? Are whites like John Brown who are engaged in vigilante activity and arming the slaves? Are they better?
Meaning better as in more effective?
More effective,
Okay.
Exactly. That's a better way, yeah. Or is David Walker better writing essays as an African American? Or is Nat Turner better at abolitionism with revolt? I mean, what is abolitionism? I mean, I'll pose this question to you. I ran across a scholar a couple of years ago. He did some field work, and they found on this far back corner of some plantation, I forget where, it was a huge cache of farm implements. Like all the wood had rotted away, but there were shovels and rakes.
Farm implements?
Yeah, just like
What is
like
that?
like picks and hoes and shovels
Okay.
and they were just like hundreds of them buried in the ground in the corner of this plantation. So it was like, what the heck? What is this?
Yeah.
So they speculate, and I think for good cause, that what slaves would do is they would get their farm implement for the day to go out and work in the fields, and they'd bust the handle and bury this stuff in the back 40 and show up and say, well, master, I don't know where the shovel is.
Yeah.
I can't. Is that
the handle broke? It's worth nothing now.
Or it was common for a lot of horses and cattle on plantations to have their back hindquarters tremendously scarred. What slaves would do is they would cut these animals and bleed them, so they became very, very weak and couldn't be used in the field. So our African Americans,
as a means to eventually rebel.
Well, is that abolitionism? Well, it's not liberating all the whole race from slavery, but it might be liberating a particular slave from slavery for a day.
It's a start. Right?
So what is abolitionism? And that's an interesting discussion, I think, that historians are having. And that ties into the larger question is abolitionism effective if it's done by African Americans that are freedmen or African Americans that are slaves? Is abolitionism better by a white person like John Brown or a white person like William Lloyd Garrison? So for your listeners, I think it might be interesting to take those four people, a freed black, a slave black, a freed white,
a violent
one, and a freed white that's writing essays.
Yeah.
So that, and then in the middle of all that is Frederick Douglass, where he's an ex-slave who now is involved in writing essays and being kind of the cause celeb of the abolition movement, a remarkable one. So Nat Turner is so interesting because it's one strand of abolitionism that's going on pre-Civil War. And again, to my point, I think we should think of it as a civil rights movement long before the 1950s.
This was always happening from the beginning.
That's my argument. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I guess let's go over quickly like what actually happened with the rebellion. I mean, what were the logistics of it?
At a certain time, the fire bell would be a signal. I forget what the signal was, but slaves would literally go around and go into slave owners' homes and kill them in their beds, which they did. So there were a lot of white people that were killed in that initial night on Nat Turner's rebellion, and immediately it spreads to other plantations. So immediately, very quickly in that county, the word went out, and slave owners and and white people gathered to put down the rebellion, and they do in a vicious, barbaric way. I mean, they literally chopped Nat Turner up in pieces and sold his fingers as mementos, and just the reprisals were horrific as a way to say, don't do this ever again.
Well, I do want to say, Nat Turner's idea behind his initial revolt. I mean, he was, I believe he was killing men, women, and children.
Yes.
White men, any white people he came across,
Yes.
regardless of age, gender,
Right.
he would kill them. And I believe he didn't believe in this just like, oh, let's just kill anybody, you know, they're white, whatever. The idea, I believe, from what he said or you know, is to strike fear and the shock factor.
Sure.
And hopefully, you know, maybe whites in the north or even some whites in the south might look at this and be like, okay, well, this doesn't come from nowhere, or just
Right.
be shocked at,
Right.
you know, that this is
Sure.
possible.
Well, think about I think, you know, strike fear is an interesting phrase. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I guess I think about it this way. If you're a slave and, say, a runaway is caught in Massachusetts and brought back to your plantation, and there's a public beating to show all the slaves on the plantation, what happens if you're a runaway and you get caught?
And did that happen in Massachusetts? Because
Well,
slavery was
Massachusetts,
banned in Massachusetts.
correct, but and all over the North, because of the Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution, you could go north, and if you could get a court through a court proceeding to yes, this is my slave, you now can take your property back. So it happened all the time that the Fugitive Slave Clause allows for this, and various state laws that were enacted because of that Fugitive Slave Clause. So to your point about fear, I would recommend that you think about, well, the system of slavery is based upon fear.
Definitely.
And so when Nat Turner says, let's strike fear, he understands fear and how it operates coming towards the slave. That it's a fear, and people understand that. So I think he's tapping into a very primitive urge and understanding of how the fear
This will
works.
get people scared.
Absolutely.
Pardon my French, shitless.
Yeah.
And it did. So let's touch
Is that
on
French, by the way?
Well, no, but you know, people say, "Pardon my French," and then
It
they
might be.
let off with some. Yeah, I'm sure there's maybe like a French root in there. I don't know.
I don't think so, but
We'll have to
I'm
figure
sorry.
that one out.
We digress.
Yes. Yes. But like you were saying earlier, the reaction in the South to this rebellion was absolutely horrific.
Yeah. Well, immediately
It
they cut
was-
down on states enacted laws where you weren't going to have itinerant preachers anymore.
And
Rome went around, so slave owners cut.
they passed something where you couldn't have a church service
Correct.
without a white minister there.
Yes. All that happened after Nat Turner, because for the most part, the owners would allow slaves to have their own services separate, and after that, no, there had to be a white preacher, or the itinerant preacher could be there, but there was a white person, usually the slave driver, attending the service to make sure everything was, there wasn't sedition being preached in the pulpit.
And after this, I mean, there was one militia in the South after this and Nat Turner's rebellion that supposedly they touted that they had killed 40 blacks in one day, and I mean they were taking stuff off their dead, anything of value off their dead bodies. You know, they boasted they got $21 or something from, and this was all over. I mean, they were attacking blacks indiscriminately. After this, I mean, and the reaction, can you talk about the reaction in the local area of, I'm not sure even where it was located.
Well, in Virginia. Well, the South, the reaction is, this is what we're going to do. Slavery is protected by our laws. Slavery is a good thing because we as white people are taking care of inferior peoples. We're giving them a place to live. We're giving them Christianity. We're allowing them to be converted to Christianity. So the paternal system of slavery, in addition to the economic and the cruelty of slavery, the Southerners just don't understand why this would happen, because in their mind, Slaves should be happy.
We treat them well.
One
we give
big
them
happy-
church services. We give them food.
Yes. It's their argument was it's a paternal system, fatherly care. I mean, fathers care for their children.
Like the Ku Klux Klan.
They make many of those paternal arguments later. The Klan does.
When you say paternal, I mean, what do you?
It's a Latin root, pater, father. Fatherly care is paternalism. When you have children, you're supposed to care for your children and provide pants and shoes and quality education and the occasional trip to Disney World. And in exchange, not
Okay.
good. You get the love and admiration of your children for doing these fatherly care type things for them.
So that was their idea. We're giving them this
Yes.
fatherly care, and so therefore I don't understand why they would want to kill us, even though we whip them, rape their women.
There's a great Southern writer. His name is last name is Fitzhugh. He was probably the greatest spokesman for this Southern paternalism, and he wrote for a lot on this paternalism of the South. So Southerners, like to your question of like how does the South react to this slave revolt? They just, first of all, they're scared to death, but then they're also like, why would these slaves do this? We treat them as family.
That's remarkable that question was actually there.
Well, a father occasionally has to discipline his children, for their own good. So the slave
So that
owner,
was their thought.
yeah. So we occasionally have to discipline.
Sometimes we gotta whip them until we can see their spine.
Well, I'm not sure anybody's going to make that argument, but I mean that's the reality. That's the reality. But the argument, devoid of all fact, is it's a Southern paternal system, family system, and so there was a lot of head scratching at the slave revolts. Now the North, they could always wag their finger and see how barbaric the South is, especially if you're an abolitionist. Now, if you could care less, if you're a Northerner and you're ambivalent about slavery, you're going to say, well, I don't care. It's a Southern problem. Let them deal with it. If you want slavery, fine. That's what you're going to have to deal with. Not my problem. So the reaction was mixed.
Okay. That's very interesting to me. Yeah, I guess where do you want to go from here?
Well, we could. This might be a good break for us before we get into post-Civil War stuff. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington.
And we still haven't even gotten to Frederick Douglass. Look at this.
Oh,
How far are we in here?
Almost 57 minutes.
Almost an hour.
All right, let's keep going,
Almost
baby.
an hour, and we haven't even gotten to Frederick Douglass. What do you guys think about that?
I think I'm talking too much and going on side alleys too much is what I think.
Well, that can happen sometimes. Sure. It happens to the best of us. I mean, I guess we can touch on Frederick Douglass.
He's I think truly a great American. Born in slavery, state of Maryland, I believe, East Shore, East Chesapeake. He has a.
Before we get into Frederick Douglass, I want to do a Frederick Douglass quote here that I really, really like.
All right, bust out with it.
I hope I get this right. I know.
Resist that urge to hotkey.
The quote. The quote is, "I would unite with anybody to do good, and with nobody to do wrong." And I think that's especially important for modern day, because even let's just say in Congress, reaching across the aisle to do good. I mean there's such a partisan divide.
Yeah.
I think that's just a great quote all around. Guys, put that on a poster and I'll buy it. All right. I just think that's a phenomenal quote.
Well, I think his life bears that out.
Mm-hmm. And he really did believe in that.
Yeah. For example, he was. Obviously, abolitionism is going to be an obvious cause that he's associated, and his primary cause. But he also was very supportive of the women's movement. Like I said earlier, in the 1840s, this gathering in Seneca Falls.
He attended that, right?
I think he did, yeah. And so he was supportive of the women's liberation, the women's civil rights movement. he also became very deep, close personal friends with William Lloyd Garrison. So to your point that
Mystery man.
he'd work with anybody, I think is the gist of the conversation. Work with anybody to do good in all kinds of different kinds of causes. So his life demonstrated that. I think that's a great quote to preface.
Can I also say he said that because he was being criticized for talking to slave owners. He would have actual conversation and dialogue with slave owners, and that was the criticism. And he said, I'll work with anybody to do some good.
The people that criticized him on that, though, did not believe that a slave owner was interested in a serious discussion about slavery.
They didn't think there was going to be any real good.
Correct. So in that regard, they're going to see him as kowtowing to slave owners because they're going to be so immovable in their position that they're not going to be persuaded. And that's the big argument against white abolitionists in the form of the essay writers. No amount of moral persuasion, no amount of Bible verses being quoted, no amount of reasoned argument is going to change anybody's mind on slavery. And so that's the basis of that criticism of Douglass. You're not going to persuade them, so why even bother?
All right. Well, tell us. I mean, there's a whole lot to go over.
He's interesting because he escapes slavery. He learns to read, in large part because a white lady, the wife of one of his masters, taught him to read, and he becomes literate and eventually escapes slavery up through
she started to teach him, right? And then her husband said no, this isn't for slaves, and
proceeded anyway.
He learned, behind, obviously continued to do that.
Sure.
Well, one thing I do want to mention too is at 16, Frederick Douglass was sent to a quote slave breaker. Do you know about this? Edward Covey.
It didn't work out very well. He eventually meets Covey real late in life, and they make up, I guess.
No kidding.
Yeah. But I'm a little fuzzy on those, but I do remember that story. Maybe you know more about it right now than I do.
I guess the gist of it was I like that, the gist of it. The gist of it was he was sent to this, quote, slave breaker, which these people were notorious for being so brutal that they would break the spirit of anybody. And so he was sent to this slave breaker, and he said that he was whipped so many...
Using fear.
Using fear.
That fear system.
It's that thing again.
Yeah.
And he said that Edward Covey broke his body, his spirit, and his soul. And there was eventually Frederick Douglass, he was getting another whipping, and he basically turned around and had a physical confrontation and whooped his ass.
Yeah.
And after that, he never got a whipping again.
Right. Yeah. I think.
And this was in Maryland too.
Yes.
This was northern.
Well, Maryland is a slave state, but I think it's a remarkably wonderful. I mean, it's awful and beautiful. My new favorite folk
you
artist.
gotta explain that.
My new favorite folk artist is a guy that originally was from Fort Atkinson. His name is Jeffrey Foucault. He has this song called Northbound 4035, and there's this line: Mustang horses, champagne glasses, anything broken, anything wild. The song is about the irony of life, that there's so many beautiful things, but so many beautiful things are also a result of brokenness. And I think your story there is a remarkable story of, because he admits he's broken and yet isn't. And so the horror...
Because he still fought back.
Yeah. And that's a beautiful story.
Mm-hmm.
About how...
Got to be careful with that, but I do know what you mean in this instance.
Well, it's remarkable that many of us have...
Beautiful in the struggle.
Yes.
In that he overcame that specific instance.
In horrific, and the odds are totally against him. And so I think many of us, can resonate that with it just in our own personal lives, the things that we may have encountered that are just horrific, and some more than others. But I think it's a great example of of him, what's in him, as what's really inside him in the midst of all of that mayhem. So, yeah, it's the Covey slave breaker is a remarkable event, I think.
And he
it's central in his biography, his autobiography, Frederick Douglass. A really wonderful short. It's I think one of the first things he wrote.
Did somebody describe it as the first scientific account of a? I'm not sure. What I'm referring to at this point.
I don't know.
But he wrote quite a lot, didn't he?
Eventually, yeah. I mean, from being illiterate to being not just a good writer, but a great writer and an unbelievable orator.
Speaker as well.
So it just really is. He's truly a great American.
How did Frederick Douglass fit in? Because he was born pre-Civil War. He saw the Civil War happen, and he passed right before the turn of the century.
Yeah. Had a decent relationship with Lincoln. Wasn't quite sure he liked him originally because there's a lot of questions about Lincoln.
We should probably touch on Lincoln.
Yeah.
For a bit.
Well, he was probably racist. But
that's another one I hear. Lincoln was a Republican and he freed the slaves.
Well, again, that's sort of true. I don't want to get knee deep in the Emancipation Proclamation, but you'll note all you have to do is look at the Emancipation and ask this question: where are the slaves being freed? Now, here's the thing: in the Emancipation Proclamation, the slaves that are being freed are the slaves in the South. Now, think about this: a president of the Union is freeing slaves of the Confederacy. So, how effective do you think the Emancipation Proclamation was in the South? It's like if Putin stands up today and says every American owes me $5. Americans will go like, well, what? Is this binding on me?
We're not giving you $5, Putin.
There's an argument by some historians that would say, look, the Emancipation was not an issue about freeing slaves. It was about...
Was it during the Civil War?
Yes, right in the middle of the Civil War.
So especially then, they're in a state of war. Why are they going to give a rat's ass what Lincoln has to say about their slaves?
Well, they don't. But I would say, look, think of the Emancipation Proclamation as doing... First of all, it's a military measure because in the Emancipation, Lincoln, in freeing the slaves, offers them jobs in the Union Army, like come be cooks and kind of behind the lines, kind of support roles in the Army. So it's also an employment program.
Interesting.
So it's robbing the South of bodies because after the Emancipation, all through the war, there's a steady stream of slaves headed towards Union camps. So
how did they know about the emancipation? Like if you're a slave on a plantation, how would you have known that Lincoln's?
Well, there's a network. Itinerant preachers, and there are freedmen. There are freedmen in the South. Not many, but there are freed blacks in the South, and they circulate.
Who have access to these kinds of things.
So the Emancipation is a military measure that robs resources from the South and puts resources in the Union troops. I'm also going to suggest that the Emancipation keeps Britain out of the war.
How so?
All through the war, there was a big question: would Britain or Europe in general side with the Confederacy? And there's a lot of reason to fear that because European societies were hierarchical. They would have been comfortable with the Southern hierarchical system. So was there that?
And they had a lot of exports too, a lot of value.
Now that's the British angle. The British Midlands up in Birmingham and Leeds and the textile areas, they needed Southern cotton. So would they side with the South because they needed cotton?
Was that for clothes? Or?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It's all about the textiles and cloth manufacturing. So what I would suggest for your consideration that the Emancipation now makes the war not about Union. It makes it about slavery. England can't get involved in the American Civil War if it's about slavery, because England outlawed slavery back in the 1820s. So how would that look for Parliament to say, yes, let's ally ourselves? Yeah, they can't do that. So I think it's an ingenious foreign policy move on Lincoln's part, the Emancipation. I don't even know how we got on emancipation, but was Lincoln racist?
Yeah, you didn't want to discuss it, and
right. Well, that's all I want to say about that. But to link to the immediate issue of Lincoln and whether was he racist or not, I think those folks that are Lincoln scholars have generally seen an evolution in Lincoln's thinking about slaves, and whether African Americans are inferior or not. In a lot of people that would say he had an evolution and became open to and embraced the idea of social equality, would credit Douglas and his influence on Lincoln. Because Douglas had some questions about Lincoln early when he first met him, but he met with him several times through the war, and was noted as saying that he grew to respect and like Lincoln, and articulated that Lincoln had been moving in a direction away from his original positions that he may have had on racist positions. So
it wasn't about necessarily freeing the slaves. It was more of a tactical wartime move.
I think
in your opinion?
In my opinion, I tend to go in that direction because and it took a Union invasion of a town or a plantation or a state for that to be true. It wasn't self-executed for the slaves to be free. I mean, okay, you write a thing that says slaves are free. Well, they're really not free until somebody shows up and enforces it. So it really did.
It'd be like the U.S. saying that Nazi or that Jews in concentration camps, they're free people now. In a way.
Yeah, right.
No, maybe I'm way off.
I think about that a little bit more. There might be an analogy in there somewhere.
I definitely didn't put it out in a way that it makes sense, but there's something there.
You're
folks.
thinking.
Yeah.
So Douglas had a tremendous. It's without a doubt he had a tremendous influence on Lincoln, and may in fact have moved Lincoln away from and more towards a more egalitarian, embracing an equality principle that Lincoln had as an earlier young man.
So, and that makes sense to me. That makes sense to me that there would be multiple tactical military reasons to do that.
But I'd like to circle back to your quote that Douglas would also work with Lincoln to do good,
even if he was a racist.
So I think it comes back to your whole framing of this discussion about Douglas. That his relationship with Lincoln may fit in that. I think it does fit within that category of him embracing anybody to work for good. Now, he eventually does have here's the weird thing. He has a falling out with William Lloyd Garrison, your Mr. Man. They toured a lot and did a lot of abolitionist speaking. And who better? I mean, who has credibility in terms of an abolitionist speech other than Frederick Douglass? I mean, holy cow. But they eventually have a falling out, and it's over the issue of, because here's the funny thing, I think, I think it's funny. Garrison, at the end of his speeches, at the end of these rallies, he would burn the Constitution because he said it was a covenant with death. It was a pro-slavery document. And so he would burn the Constitution, and this was a good, nothing to get a crowd worked up. And, the equivalent today would be burning the flag.
Yeah.
But Douglas didn't see the Constitution as a pro-slavery document, so that he and Garrison...
He said he believed in the liberal values of the Constitution,
yes,
right? And he was an ex-slave, which is interesting.
Yes, whereas Garrison didn't. So they had a disagreement. I mean, Douglas saw the Constitution as, within the Constitution, there's a way to reform and change this. Garrison did not. He did not believe the Constitution could be used to correct the sin.
What did he think was this?
Well, Garrison was a few of those folks in the North that actually praised John Brown. So the question was, okay, although he's an essay writer and he has these newspapers that he publishes essays, is he egging on? Is he actually encouraging the more militant,
militant act?
Yes. Yeah. So.
Now, Frederick Douglass as well, he was used as an example by abolitionists in a response to pro-slavery people to say, look, this guy is absolutely brilliant. He was a slave. He's black.
Mm-hmm.
And the pro-slavery people were, one of the main things was black people can't be intelligent. Slaves aren't capable of being smart.
Right.
And so he was used as this example of like, look at this guy.
Right.
You're telling me that slaves can't be smart?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, if given the chance, it's remarkable what people can do, regardless of your race. So, it's a constant problem for pro-slavery people to be confronted with a very erudite orator, a great writer.
Erudite?
Erudite, yeah.
Erudite.
Yeah. Speaks well.
These big words are
Sorry,
way too much.
I'm sorry.
I'm just a layperson here. I can't even say layman, even though saying layman implies that you're a stupid man. But hey,
No.
So specifically, what does erudite mean?
Well spoken, has a big vocabulary.
Okay.
Great orator.
All right.
EU.
fantastic acumen and syntax.
Whoa. Yeah, you know a few big words.
I don't even know what I just said, but yeah, it
Erudite.
sounds right, doesn't it?
Erudite. Yeah.
Erudite. Okay.
Yeah. So to your
Look it up, folks.
Your
Look
point.
up-
I mean,
look up
Douglas
erudite.
Douglas is an outstanding example. That's hard for the more militant racists to say. African Americans are inferior and they're never going to be the equals of whites.
And so was he nominated for vice president, Frederick Douglass?
Yeah, I think he didn't even know about it too. He was kind of irritated about that.
He was pissed off. So
He was funny. I visited his home. Yeah.
So hang on.
I don't.
So,
I don't know. I'm
no, but
focusing
I
on-
did see something about this. Without
Yeah.
his knowledge, he was nominated for vice president, and he just woke
Probably
up one
third-
day and they were like,
Probably
"Hey,
a third party, probably a minor party. But
yeah." But still, I mean, that's one hell of a thing to wake up to. Is like, hey, you're nominated for vice president.
Yeah.
I'd be
Yeah,
mad
he
about
was-
how does one respond to something like that?
Hey,
Yeah.
be mad, man.
Yeah.
He was an interesting. He can be prickly. A couple of years ago, I visited his home in Anacostia. It's south of the Capitol in Washington D.C. And he had this building in the back of his house, and it's basically a glorified shed that he made into an office. So when he went into his office, and all his friends call it the growlery. Because when you went out there and you wanted to knock on the door and ask him something or tell him that there was a visitor there to see him, he had this huge booming voice. I mean, think James Earl Jones or Morgan Freeman. He would growl like, "Go away!"
So they'd knock on his shed and you just
knock on his shed. If you got a growl, you left him alone. So he can be prickly.
they call it the growly.
The growlery.
The
The growlery.
you guys heard it.
Yeah, this was later in life. His home is I think it's a National Historic Place in D.C. there. Everybody should go visit it. I think it's really cool.
What are some other significant things that he's known for?
Well, one of the great essays he wrote was what does the fourth mean to the black man?
What the fourth?
Fourth of
That
July.
sounds like a very pleasant way to say
No,
use
it's
some French.
Fourth. No, the 4th of July.
Okay.
What a lot of people don't understand is back in the early days of our republic, all over America in town squares, people gathered to hear the Declaration read. We have fireworks now, but back in the day, they had parades and everything, and usually the mayor or some big shot in town would read the Declaration of Independence, front to back. And it was, as you might expect, it was a cause for great celebration. Well, Frederick Douglass's essay on what does the 4th of July mean to a black man, it's a long essay, but again, like David Walker, and I think at various points in Douglass's career, he references David Walker as kind of an influence on him.
Yeah.
But Douglass says, what have I or those I represent to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence have been extended to us? What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than any other day of the year the gross injustice, cruelty, and hypocrisy, and we are the constant victims.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to. I mean, yeah. I wonder what the general sentiment for July 4th is in the black community. I'm gonna have to ask someone about that.
I was talking to a friend of mine not too long ago, and he made the argument that maybe Juneteenth Day is,
and that's something I saw recently.
African American 4th of July.
I really didn't know much about this until I think this year, Juneteenth.
Yeah, it's got a lot of presence. So I
talk about that.
Well, June 17th was the day where, in the middle of the Civil War, a lot of slave owners left their plantations and they moved west into Texas and took their slaves with them. And the argument was that they could take their slaves west and kind of be protected from all this mess of the Civil War. And so parts of Texas were just so remote. I mean, you might as well be on Mars. And so June 17th of 65 was the day that news that the emancipation and the Civil War were over actually reached the far western regions of Texas. So
that's what Juneteenth
was the day that
is that June 17th? What is that?
Yeah, 1865. And so ever since then, Juneteenth has been celebrated with various degrees of popularity, but it's always circulated in and around African American communities. So I would recommend, for your consideration, that Juneteenth may be the African American July 4th. I think that might be a reasonable way to think about that.
It's also something to note that Nat Turner originally had his rebellion planned for July 4th, which I think is pretty awesome. I mean, that's if you were going to do something like that in that kind of a scenario, July 4th would be the day. Independence Day.
Timothy McVeigh blew up Oklahoma City on April 15th. Lexington.
Was he the Unabomber?
No, he blew up the Oklahoma City Myrtle Federal Building on the day of Lexington Concord. Symbolic.
What was Lexington Concord?
The shot heard around the world. The first when
what started the Revolutionary War?
Arguably, that's the first shot of the American Revolution.
And to this day, nobody has any idea who actually fired it. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's some question of who shot and fired.
Well, you would know. I mean, this is you read.
I read the
all these people's
I don't know.
all these dead people's mail. You go through newspapers from this time, and there's no real answer to who fired.
No,
that
there's
shot.
not. But I do know this: as those soldiers were moving west out of Boston out to Lexington Concord, they were getting shot at by colonists behind the bushes and stuff. I think maybe one of your family trips when you were a kid, I think maybe your folks talked to me about that trip that you made out to Lexington. I think they showed me a picture of you and your brother and sister reenacting the capturing of Paul Revere. But that
was great. That was a great time.
Great.
By the way, Northeast, there's so much history out there, folks. If you can get out there, definitely do it and to either talk to somebody who knows about the places to visit or just research the places to visit. There's a lot of really neat history out there.
But anyway, but I do know the British were getting shot at on their way out to Lexington Concord. So they'd been facing bullets even before they got to Lexington Concord. So they were good and angry. So who actually fired the first shot on the green there at the bridge at Lexington Concord? It's inconclusive. But
that's crazy to me. Our country is born out of a shot we don't even know who fired.
Well, but isn't that kind of beautiful? I think
It is. Well, I guess. Yeah. I mean, it is.
It's beautiful and it's broken.
It's that seems like the theme of a lot of things these days.
Sure.
Huh.
So yeah, I think Frederick Douglass is it's a great essay to read. What does the Fourth mean to the black man? One of his more famous. Now later on, he would write about education issues, and that would also play into eventually with the debates about education between people like Booker T. Washington and Du Bois. But they came immediately after Douglass.
And this is something this is kind of backtracking, but after Nat Turner's rebellion, I want to talk about the legislation that was passed in the South, because it wasn't just I mean, there was voter suppression legislation. There was, you couldn't have any. There was no allowing for black assembly.
Right.
You couldn't get together with people.
Illegal to teach African Americans to read.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Huge. I mean,
Yeah.
almost complete restriction on education.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, what are we missing? Anything else?
No, I think, and it's predictable that South would react this way due to
Given
that.
the nature of what
Yeah.
they.
Now there were other slave revolts, but the most notable is Nat Turner, and that's the one that always makes the high school history books.
I know that name especially because he's
Yeah.
he's referenced in so many
Yep.
rap songs. I listen to a lot
Really?
of rap.
Okay.
Oh yeah. I mean, there's at least 10. There's at least 10. I mean, probably even
I was
far
not
more
aware of
than
that.
Yeah, I mean, there's this one rapper, Immortal Technique, in a song called "The Point of No Return." He goes,
Oh, Kansas. That's
Yeah.
a great album by Kansas. The
Really?
Point of No Return.
Huh.
KNOW.
I wonder if he made that.
I'm gonna doubt that, but
He's a pretty. I mean, he's a college educated guy, but yeah, one of his. It's a very short line, but he says, "Nat Turner with the sickle, pitchfork, and machete, the end of the world. You not ready." But that's an interesting thing too. Is they didn't use guns. Nat Turner did not use guns specifically because it drew attention. They would only use
sure.
shovels, hose,
Quiet
whatever.
Paths.
I mean, would it have drawn that much attention?
I don't know how I would imagine screaming from the mansion is going to generate some attention, but obviously gunshots is a whole different issue.
It wasn't rural enough to the point where you could do that kind of a thing, or I don't know.
Well, I
That's
think
something I wondered
originally
about.
what happened in the original plantation that they started this is I think somebody escaped and went to neighboring plantations, and then word started to circulate around.
Because they went from house to house and,
Yeah.
and freed slaves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But some people escaped, and that's how word started to circulate.
All right. Well, how are we on time, Mike?
We're at 1:26.
1:26. Are we gonna have to wrap this up soon? Do you think?
I mean, it's up to you guys. It's
Okay. Well, I guess let's touch on Booker T. Washington.
Okay.
Well, and the problem is, if we touch on Booker T. Washington, we have to talk about W.E.B. Du
Yeah,
Bois.
so maybe that's
because-
another session.
Quite possibly. I mean, what
That
time
gets
is
us to
it?
the 20th century.
8:41.
8:41. Oh,
Doing
Your
it
call, folks.
live.
what's that?
Doing it live.
Doing it live, guys. This is how you get people to pay attention. You do real life. All right. You take off your headphones and you just speak from the heart. Mike, shut the door. We have casual conversations here. This is real life. We're just.
It is hot in here. Since you got
Oh man, we're gonna have to get some. We're gonna have to get some AC or some fans or something legitimate. Because I mean,
it's
my
toasty.
face is probably as red as a tomato right
It's
now.
toasty.
But
Anyway, your call. Whether you want to continue on or whether you
well, I guess let's just brush over a few things we've already talked about to see if we've missed any details. I guess instead of we can get into Booker T and W.E.B. Du Bois a little bit later. Dubois, as the French say, right?
Du
Mike?
Bois.
Yes,
Du
sir.
Bois. Du
Du
Bois
Bois.
is the uncultured swine American.
No,
way to
that's
say it.
actually how he said it. So it's Du Bois.
So he pronounced it Du
Yeah,
Bois.
it's Du Bois.
Oh, I guess it's just the French then. Huh. All right. Well, let me put it. I mean, yeah, my ears are
Now, we
sweating.
don't want to
This is-
discriminate. Let's be clear about that. We hold absolutely nothing against the French.
No, the French are great. The French are great. I mean, they hold like a.
We wouldn't have
mini-
won the revolution without him.
Yeah, that's true. And well, let's explain that in a second. But we love the French. We
that's
love
a
the-
side. We really get sidetracked with
Well,
it.
no, it's relevant. It's relevant. But the important thing is, the French revolt every year. Apparently, they don't smell great. I don't know if I really believe that.
Yeah, I was going to
But
say there's
they do hold, like,
there's
they-
several stereotypes in that sentence
And
that you just.
They hold, oh yeah, no, I'm being an ignorant ass right now is what I'm doing. I'm not. There's no legitimacy to what I'm saying. But they do hold like mini revolutions every year. They just like little riots they throw. It seems, which yeah, I guess I get
They
it.
burn tires.
But Macron was my I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Their preferred form of protest is burning tires. I find that quite interesting.
What? I mean, is it because of the chemicals? It smells? Does it keep burning?
I'm sure there's somebody that's researched that.
Mike knows something.
Part of it is because it creates an extremely large impact. It's
Yeah.
almost impossible to ignore
Yep.
because you're going to get the smell. You're going to get very, very thick smoke, and it does last for a long time, in addition to being extremely difficult to put out,
Yeah.
even with professional firefighting techniques.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about
There
the
you go.
smell of that. That's got to go for blocks at least.
Sustained inconvenience.
It's not great.
You get like 20 tires, pour some gasoline on it. Oh man, I wouldn't want to be in that city. Yeah. Well, okay. Why were the French necessary for? I'm trying to get back into the serious conversation. Why were the French
Do you
necessary?
really want to go back to the revolution and derail our Washington and Du Bois?
Where do you want to go?
Let's go. We can do American Revolution stuff some other point, but the short answer is we needed money.
And the French supplied them?
And the Navy, very critical because we didn't have either of those. So yeah, the French, in my estimation, we wouldn't have had a success without the French.
Okay. Well, I don't know. Are we gonna wrap this? I mean, I can go for hours. That's just me. I don't know what we're.
I'm along for the ride. Whatever you guys want to do.
All right. Let's do 30 more minutes.
Okay. All right.
All right. We'll do 15 minutes.
I do have to get home to the wife eventually here.
I'll try to
we
keep my
can't- we can't
responses
miss her.
short.
No, that's all right. Let's do 10 minutes.
Okay.
Let's just do a quick.
All right.
What do we want to talk about here, guys? I apologize for the lull and flow of information for you guys, but
Well, you can edit that out.
no editing here.
Okay.
Let's not talk about that. We don't.
Okay.
Editing is for people with fear. That's what that's what editing is for, or for propaganda. You can ask CNN and Fox about that. Yeah, they're both the same guys. Get used to it. Yeah. All right. I mean, is there anything between David Walker, Nat Turner, and you gotta help me out here. What are
Well, we talked about Douglas, Turner, John Brown. We talked a little bit off and on about William Lloyd Garrison. So, I mean, all of those I would consider a part of a pre-civil rights movement.
How did
Now remember, before the Civil War, the civil rights movement, as I'm defining it, pretty much is in large part about abolitionism. Now, once slavery is abolished, now the civil rights movement has a whole bunch of other issues to address, other than just getting rid of slavery. Now you get into issues of legal standing, economic standing. So all the other issues now become the civil rights movement.
it's more about equality as opposed to just straight up let's stop slavery?
Yeah, right. To my original point, the meaning of equality. What does it mean to be a freed slave? So much of the effort pre-Civil War of civil rights was abolitionism. Now that it's abolished, now what is the issue? And I would suggest for your listeners to think about the complexity of that question. So in that regard, there may be many civil rights movements addressing issues of economics, issues of education, all kinds of issues now come to the forefront after the Civil War, because now abolition's off the table.
And there's a huge contrast between the North and South as far as
Sure.
progression.
Sure. I mean, after
okay,
the
let's
war, the
just-
Republicans
before we
the Northern Republicans wanted to rebuild the South to be a more egalitarian industrial society, and the South wanted no part of it. And so this is why you have the backlash to Northern Reconstruction, and you have the start after 1876. You start to get Jim Crow laws, segregation, lynching.
Now,
all of those things occur.
Before we wrap up, I just want to ask what was the time period for Jim Crow? And this folks, this is something we're going to go over Jim Crow. We're eventually going to get to this. I mean, the civil rights movement. At this point, the way we've been talking, we'll be lucky if we get through it in one podcast, in one take. But what was the time period for Jim Crow, and what was the short like a synopsis of the context?
Well, Jim Crow, the Jim Crow Society, is arguably a result of all the events coming out of post-Civil War South. The 13th Amendment was passed, and so the original statement was, from Andrew Johnson, the new president, because Lincoln was assassinated, if you want back in the country, South, you have to get rid of rewrite your constitutions, get rid of slavery, and ask, and your Southern leaders need to ask me for permission and confess your sins, and everything's good. Well, that's not a very significant reconstruction. That's more like reconciliation. And so what started happening in the South is Southern states started passing what were called black codes that were very, very restrictive of newly freed slaves. Couldn't own weapons, had to have licensed preachers, couldn't marry outside your race, had to have a job. If you didn't have a job, you could be arrested and hired out, many times to your former masters. So in many ways, the black codes in many ways is a pre-Jim Crow system, because it said, okay, you're not a slave anymore, but we're certainly going to treat you like a second-class person, and you're not going to have any rights, and you're inferior, and we're going to treat you that way and keep you that way. So I would recommend that to your listeners that Jim Crow isn't automatically just post-1876 when Northern troops leave the South. I mean, the Northerners basically gave up on Reconstruction. They said, this is too much effort. These Southerners are too resistant. The Grant administration was arguably fairly corrupt. And so Northerners got sick and tired of the corruption and the hassle of Reconstruction. So they leave the South. And Southerners, in a sense, who were called redeemers, redeemed the South from these Northern Reconstruction crazies trying to make us into something we're not. So that's when what many people would call the Jim Crow system, segregation and intimidation through lynchings and Klan activities.
Okay.
But my argument is the black codes in the late 1860s, early 70s, in a way was a segregated Jim Crow system. Okay. But we didn't have that label until later.
All right. Well, this is all stuff we're going to be diving into in the future. If you or anybody would be interested in getting on, please get in touch. We will work to make that happen. If you like the content, please like and subscribe. It's all very helpful.
Well, I hope your friend takes a gander at our discussion, because I've often said that.
My friend?
You started a whole podcast out with a friend who kind of wanted to know which political party we were going to espouse in here, and so maybe.
Wait, I'm kind of lost now.
Well, his point was, the Democrats started the Klan. Well, that's true.
Yeah.
So a little bit of history.
And once again, guys, this is nothing against. I really like this guy. He's a really good friend, and it's just that's kind of why I'm doing this. We need to take a step back and realize neither of these parties. Now, this is my opinion, guys. This is my opinion. Neither of these parties give the remotest shit about us. I could have used some more. Well, yeah, it's explicit.
Pardon your French, right?
Yeah, pardon my French. I wanted to drop an F-bomb there. I'm trying to be somewhat formal, since you're a scholar. You talk to profession.
You should be at our house when I do home repair plumbing. It's a different kind of language.
I can only imagine. Well, I guess thank you guys for tuning in who've made it this far.
Yeah. Thanks for this has been great.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
No, and once again, if it's up to me, I'll have you back on. If you don't want to,
no.
That's all you.
If we can work it out, I'd love to be back.
Okay. I'm signing off with this, folks. Limit your social media. read more, but not too much, so that you can still learn. All right, guys.
Thank you.
That's all we've got for you. Thank you for tuning in.